History is often written in blood, but in the Belgian Congo, it was written in cursive. Between 1908 and 1960, a silence fell over the heart of Africa, a silence kept not by whispers, but by filing cabinets. Behind the locked doors of basement archives in Brussels, a secret lay dormant for nearly a century. It was the story of the les enfants de la colonie, the children of the colony. Somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 mixed-race children vanished. They weren't lost to famine or war. They were systematically harvested, torn from their African mothers' arms by colonial authorities who documented every theft with the chilling precision of a grocery receipt. To the state, they were a logistical problem. To the mothers, they were the children of shame. Today, we open those sealed folders to tell a story the history books tried to bury under layers of dust and civilizing lies. This is the documented horror of the Belgian Congo's stolen generation. The paper trail of terror began not with an act of sudden violence, but with the cold scratching of fountain pens across thick, official parchment. These documents were the primary weapons used by the Belgian Colonial administration to transform a living, breathing child into a mere entry in a ledger. Each birth of a mixed-race infant triggered a specialized bureaucratic mechanism designed to assess the child's viability for the state's dark social experiment. While the mothers saw a miracle, the agents of Brussels saw only a logistical error that required immediate correction through systemic filing. They believed that by capturing a child's identity on paper, they could effectively own their future and erase their past. This was the quiet, terrifying foundation of the Children of Shame program, where ink replaced the iron shackle as the tool of modern enslavement. Within these basement archives, the Belgian government curated a library of stolen lives that remained hidden from the world for nearly a century. Every transaction, from the initial removal to the final placement in a mission, was recorded with a meticulousness that bordered on the obsessive. They tracked the father's European lineage and the mother's indigenous status, as if they were grading the quality of extracted minerals or rubber. These files were not meant to preserve history, but to control it, ensuring that no child could ever trace their way back. The archives were stamped classified, a designation that served as a steel door between thousands of broken families and the truth. It was a secret kept by filing cabinets and rigid bureaucratic protocols that valued the order of the state over human blood. The specific language used in these decrees, such as the infamous Decree 1523, was a masterpiece of legalistic euphemism designed to mask profound cruelty. The documents never used words like kidnapping or theft, opting instead for phrases like transfer of custody or proper Christian upbringing. This linguistic mask allowed the men who signed the papers to maintain a facade of moral authority while committing acts of absolute desolation. By framing the removal as a state necessity, they absolved the European fathers of all legal and financial responsibility for their children. The law was a shield for the colonizer and a sword against the colonized, cutting the most fundamental bond known to humanity. It was a violence of the mind, where the stroke of a pen could legally unmake a mother's right to her own daughter. When an agent arrived to take a child, the receipt he offered was the final, stinging insult in a process of total dehumanization. These small slips of paper were handed to sobbing mothers as if they were concluding a simple market transaction for cattle or copper ore. The receipt effectively turned the child into property of the state, a physical manifestation of the colonial belief that African humanity was negotiable. To the Belgian authorities, the paper trail was proof of a job well done, a metric of efficiency in maintaining the racial order. To the mothers, those papers were the only physical evidence that their children had ever existed, though they were written in a language many could not read. This document served as a tombstone for the child's original identity, marking the moment they were spiritually and legally severed. The meticulousness of the record-keeping revealed a deep-seated fear within the Belgian administration that the racial lines might one day blur. They believed that if they did not document and remove every mixed-race child, the very foundation of their colonial fantasy would eventually crumble. Every file was a brick in a wall built to keep the civilized world separate from the savage one they claimed to be helping. The agents who filled out these forms did so with the conviction of men performing a divine duty for the king. They didn't see the tears on the parchment. They only saw the requirements of the decree and the importance of a clean archive. This systemic obsession with data and documentation ensured that the theft was not a rogue act, but a core function of the government. Even decades after the Congo gained independence, these paper trails continued to exert a ghost-like control over the lives of the stolen generation. The survivors, now adults, found themselves fighting against the very archives that had once facilitated their kidnapping just to find a name. For many, the trail ended in a dead end of falsified birth locations and redacted surnames, a final act of bureaucratic erasure from beyond the grave. The paper trail was never just about a single moment of theft. It was about a lifelong sentence of identity-less wandering. It proved that the pen is not only mightier than the sword, but, in the hands of a colonizer, far more insidious. Today, these yellowed documents stand as the only witnesses to a crime that was designed to be perfectly legal and entirely forgotten. Gemini said, "The architecture of colonial Elizabethville was a physical manifesto written in stone and soil, designed to broadcast the absolute power of the Belgian crown. To walk its streets in the 1920s was to move through a landscape where geography itself was weaponized to reinforce a rigid racial hierarchy. The European quarter was perched on the highest ground, a deliberate choice to ensure the colonizers inhaled the cleanest breezes and remained physically elevated above those they ruled. Here, the wide boulevards were lined with imported jacaranda trees, their purple blossoms creating a vibrant canopy that shielded Belgian officials from the harsh African sun. The administrative buildings were constructed with a heavy European arrogance, featuring grand facades and cool, tiled interiors that mirrored the halls of Brussels. It was a city built on the sweat of the Congolese, yet every brick was placed to remind them that they were outsiders in their own ancestral land. Separated from this European paradise by a surgical line of demarcation lay the site indigene, the native quarter, where the air was thick with red dust. This was a sprawling labyrinth of unpaved streets and mud-brick dwellings that existed in a state of perpetual shadows and stifling, stagnant heat. While the Europeans enjoyed manicured gardens and tennis courts, the African population was crowded into lowlands where the breeze never reached and the sanitation was non-existent. This physical separation was not an accident of urban planning, but a calculated strategy to ensure that the two worlds never truly touched. The red dust of the native quarter coated everything, serving as a constant, gritty reminder of the divide between the rulers and the laborers. It was a world apart, separated by invisible but impenetrable barriers of race, wealth, and the cold indifference of the colonial administration. The layout of the city functioned as a visual manifestation of a social pyramid that placed young Belgian administrators at its absolute, untouchable apex. These men, often fresh from Brussels on 3-year contracts, lived lives of relative luxury, attended by a silent retinue of African domestic servants. They moved through the city with an air of permanence, supported by a system that viewed the Congolese as mere tools for the extraction of mineral wealth. Below the administrators were the territorial agents, the mid-level enforcers who managed the day-to-day brutality of colonial rule with iron fists and heavy boots. At the bottom of this rigid hierarchy were the Congolese people, stripped of their agency and forced to navigate a city that felt like a foreign occupation. This structure ensured that every interaction, no matter how small, was governed by the terrifying reality of total European dominance. Within the opulent homes of the European quarter, women like Marie-Therese Cawena lived in a strange, predatory state of constant and agonizing scrutiny. As domestic servants, they were expected to be invisible ghosts, scrubbing floors and preparing meals without ever making eye contact with their Belgian employers. Yet, this enforced invisibility was a dangerous lie, as their bodies were simultaneously considered both racially inferior and perpetually available to the masters of the house. The household was a microcosm of the colony, a place where the racial boundaries were most intimate and, paradoxically, most violently enforced. Young African women moved through these halls with a quiet, simmering resentment, knowing that the civilizing mission was just a mask for deep exploitation. They were trapped in a different kind of servitude, one where their humanity was acknowledged only enough to make them useful for labor or lust. This architecture of segregation created a climate of casual surveillance where every African movement was monitored and documented by the colonial police. The European fantasy of Elizabethville depended entirely on the silence and submission of the native quarter, which was kept in a state of constant fear. The city was divided with such precision that a person's location at any given time defined their legal rights and their very social worth. Even the social clubs and leisure spaces of the Europeans were strategically placed to oversee the mining operations, linking luxury directly to the extraction of copper. The red earth that the Congolese walked upon was the same earth being gutted for cobalt and uranium, fueling a distant European empire. In this environment, the birth of a mixed-race child was not just a scandal. It was a physical crack in the city's meticulously crafted foundations. The contrast between the purple blossoms of the jacarandas and the red mine dust served as a haunting metaphor for the stolen generation's origins. One world represented the aesthetic beauty of the colonizer's life, while the other represented the raw, bleeding reality of the colonized's daily struggle for survival. By building a city that looked like a European jewel, the Belgians attempted to justify their presence and their policies as a form of progress. However, the reality was a systemic institutionalization of child removal designed to protect this fragile, artificial order at any human cost. The city's wide boulevards were paths for the black Ford trucks that would eventually carry away the children, turning the architecture of the city into a trap. Elizabethville was not a home for its African inhabitants. It was a beautiful, terrifying stage for the erasure of their fundamental human bonds. The mission schools of the Belgian Congo operated as sophisticated identity laundries, designed to scrub the African soul from the children of the Métis. These whitewashed buildings, baking under the relentless Katongan sun, were far more than educational centers. They were the front lines of a spiritual and cultural erasure. Upon entry, every child was stripped of their original name, a vital link to their mother's lineage and history, and rebranded with European surnames. This was a systematic effort to break the most fundamental human bonds and replace them with a fabricated Belgian identity. The church and state worked in tandem to ensure that the children of shame would never find their way back to their roots. By renaming them, the authorities effectively declared that their lives began only once they became property of the mission. Within these high walls topped with broken glass, the use of any indigenous language was treated as a moral failing or a primitive sin. Children caught whispering in Swahili or Luba were subjected to brutal punishments, such as kneeling for hours on dried corn kernels in the chapel. The goal was to make the mother tongue synonymous with pain, forcing the children to adopt French as their only means of expression. This enforced amnesia was meant to silence the echoes of the lullabies their mothers had sung to them in the dark. By killing the language, the mission schools successfully killed the children's ability to communicate with their own families. They were being forged into a new class of people who were educated enough to serve the colony but too alienated to ever lead their own people. The daily curriculum was a relentless indoctrination into the supposed superiority of the Belgian crown and the Catholic faith. Children were taught to revere a distant motherland they had never seen, while being told that their biological mothers were incapable of love or morality. The priests and nuns acted as the ultimate authorities, weaving a narrative that the children had been saved from a life of darkness and degradation. This psychological warfare was designed to instill a deep sense of gratitude toward their captors and a corresponding shame toward their African heritage. Every prayer recited and every hymn sung was a brick in a wall built to separate them from their true origins. They were raised to be European in mind, even as the colonial society reminded them they would never truly be equal. The physical isolation of the missions, often located kilometers away from the nearest town, ensured that the mother's pleas would fall on deaf ears. Sisters like the stern Margarita met grieving mothers at the gate with cold, rehearsed explanations about the children's need for clean transitions. They argued that any contact with the African world would only confuse the children and hinder their progress toward civilization. This logic transformed the act of kidnapping into a humanitarian duty, shielding the perpetrators from the reality of their own cruelty. The high walls were not just to keep the children in, but to keep the truth of their mother's enduring love out. Inside, the children grew up believing they were orphans of a primitive culture, unaware of the women standing on termite mounds just beyond the glass. As the children grew, the mission schools began to implement a tiered system of erasure based on the shade of their skin. Those with the lightest complexions were marked for a different fate, often vanishing from the mission records entirely as they were prepared for secret transport. These children were the primary targets of the vanishing, where their African identity was fully liquidated to facilitate their placement in Belgium. The mission functioned as a processing plant, grading and sorting human lives based on how well they could blend into a European landscape. This was the ultimate betrayal of the mission's supposed spiritual mandate, turning a house of God into a marketplace of racial engineering. The children became products of a state-sponsored program, their humanity secondary to their utility as symbols of a successful civilizing mission. The legacy of these identity laundries is a generation of survivors who are still searching for the fragments of their original selves. The amnesia forced upon them by the missions was so complete that many reached adulthood without knowing a single true detail about their birth. They were left in a vacuum, belonging neither to the European world that rejected them nor the African world they were taught to fear. The psychological scars of being told their mothers abandoned them out of necessity remain a haunting weight for those who survived the program. The mission schools did not just educate, they hollowed out a generation, leaving behind a silence that no amount of Belgian history could ever fill. Today, the ruins of these missions stand as monuments to a time when faith was used as a weapon to steal the future. The 200-franc payment handed to Marie-Therese was the ultimate instrument of dehumanization, transforming a sacred bond into a cold market transaction. This was not a gift or a gesture of support, but a symbolic purchase that officially terminated her legal and moral rights as a mother. By putting a price on the head of a 3-month-old infant, the Belgian administration effectively categorized the child as a commodity, no different from the copper or rubber being extracted from the surrounding hills. The colonial agents used the exchange of currency to wash their hands of the blood and tears shed during the removal process. For the state, the transaction was complete the moment the bills touched the mother's trembling palm. It was a calculated act of cruelty that turned the red dust of Elizabethville into a marketplace of souls. The amount of 200 francs was a figure derived from the same cold, mathematical logic that governed the mining quotas of the Union Minière. It represented approximately 2 months of a domestic servant's wages, a pittance intended to signify that the child's value was both finite and low. This specific valuation was designed to humiliate the mother, implying that her grief could be bought and satisfied with a handful of paper bills. The colonial government believed that by paying the mothers, they were creating a legal facade of consent, as if a poverty-stricken woman could truly agree to the theft of her child. These bills were the physical evidence of a system that believed every human connection had a price tag. In the eyes of the Belgian crown, this was not a crime. It was simply another entry in the ledger of colonial expenses. When Peter Vandenberg placed the money in Marie-Therese' hand and closed her fingers around it, he was performing a final act of dismissal. This gesture was meant to silence her, to offer a fair trade for the life he was carrying away in the back of a black Ford truck. The bills themselves were likely crisp and clean, a stark contrast to the red earth and the raw, unwashed pain of a mother whose breasts were still full of milk for her missing daughter. To the agents, the transaction was a professional duty executed with the same detached efficiency they brought to collecting taxes or enforcing labor laws. They did not see a woman being destroyed. They saw a logistical problem being settled through a standard administrative procedure. The money was a wall, built to block any future claims or emotional appeals from the seller. Marie-Therese did not throw the money away, nor did she spend it on the bread or clothes she so desperately needed in her poverty. Instead, she kept the 200 francs as a haunting relic, a tangible piece of evidence that the world had indeed conspired to steal her flesh and blood. She hid the cloth bag containing the bills under her floorboards, moving them with her like a curse from one household to the next for over 50 years. The ink on the notes faded and the paper grew soft and feathered at the edges, mirroring the slow weathering of her own heart. Those francs were not currency to her. They were the physical weight of her daughter's absence, a constant reminder of the day her motherhood was appraised and discarded. They were the only thing the Belgian government had ever truly given her in exchange for her entire world. The market of motherhood extended far beyond the walls of individual homes, creating a climate where children were seen as assets to be managed by the state. Territorial agents were often judged by their ability to clear the native quarters of mixed-race children, effectively making child snatching a metric of professional success. The payment system ensured that the fathers, often prominent European men, were protected from the unpleasantness of paternity by essentially buying out the mother's interest. This protected the racial purity of the European quarter while providing the missions with a steady supply of children for their social engineering projects. The system was a self-sustaining loop of extraction, where the most precious resource taken from the Congo was not minerals, but its future generation. The 200 francs served as the grease that kept this horrific bureaucratic machine moving without friction or formal complaint. Today, the memory of those 200-franc transactions stands as a chilling testament to how easily civilization can be used as a cloak for organized crime. The Belgian government eventually admitted that the payment was a tactic to facilitate the kidnapping, but for decades it was defended as a humanitarian grant. This market logic successfully severed thousands of family trees, leaving a legacy of trauma that no amount of modern compensation can ever fully repair. The mothers who stood on the termite mounds outside the missions were the ones who refused to let the transaction be the final word on their children's lives. They proved that while a state can put a price on a body, it can never truly own the soul or the memory of the one who was taken. The story of the 200 francs is the story of a price paid for a silence that has finally, loudly, been broken. The second layer of the Belgian crime was the systematic vanishing of children, a secret operation that moved beneath the surface of the missions. While many mothers believed their children were simply being educated behind the mission walls, a darker sorting process was taking place in the shadows. Father Antoine Dubois was among the first to notice that certain children, specifically those with the lightest complexions, would suddenly disappear from the rolls without explanation. These were not random departures, but carefully selected transfers, orchestrated by the high-ranking officials of the colonial ministry in Brussels. The mission served as a temporary holding cell where the children were scrubbed of their African identity before being erased from the continent entirely. This was the final stage of the colonial experiment, where the state sought to fully reclaim the European blood flowing through the children's veins. The official records for these missing children were masterpieces of bureaucratic obstruction, designed to lead any inquisitive soul into a permanent dead end. Entries in the ledger would simply state relocated for education or placed with an approved family, providing no names, dates, or destinations. When Du Bois attempted to trace these children, he was met with a wall of polite but firm silence from the Administration Territorial in Elizabethville. The files were kept under high-level classification, ensuring that the biological mothers would never be able to find their children even if they survived the mission system. This enforced amnesia was a second kidnapping, a paper-based murder that killed the child's past to create a hollow future. The Belgian state acted as a ghost maker, turning living children into blank slates to be written upon by a distant motherland. These light-skinned children were surreptitiously loaded onto ships and planes, destined for a country they had only heard about in prayers and schoolbooks. Upon arrival in Belgium, they were often placed in foster homes or specialized institutions where their Congolese heritage was treated as a shameful secret to be buried. Many of these children were told that their mothers had died in childbirth or had willingly signed them away because they didn't want them. This lie was the cornerstone of their new lives, a psychological shackle that ensured they would never seek a way back to the Congo. They were being integrated into Belgian society as orphans of the state, their true origins hidden under a veneer of European respectability. It was a cold, clinical integration that required the total destruction of the child's original sense of self. The families in Belgium who took these children were often complicit in the silence, rarely asking questions about the mothers who had been left behind. They were told they were doing a Christian deed by providing a home to a child who had no one, a narrative that conveniently ignored the reality of the 200-franc theft. No photographs were sent back to the Congo, and no letters were allowed to pass between the children and the women who stood on the termite mounds. The colonial administration viewed this as a success, a way to salvage the European portion of the child's heritage while discarding the problematic African half. This secret pipeline transformed the children into symbols of a successful civilizing mission, while in reality they were victims of a state-sponsored human trafficking ring. The vanishing was the ultimate expression of colonial arrogance, assuming that a state could better define a child's home than their own mother. Henri Jaspa and other officials in Brussels defended these actions as necessary for the greater purpose of the colony's social order. They believed that a mixed-race class in the Congo would eventually become a source of political instability and dissent against Belgian rule. By physically removing the most European-looking children, they hoped to prevent the formation of a group that might bridge the divide between the colonizer and the colonized. The vanishing was a defensive measure, a preemptive strike against the inevitable end of the colonial era. It was a crime committed by men in suits and ties, discussed in quiet offices over coffee, far from the sound of the mother's screams. The efficiency of the operation was a source of pride for the ministry, a metric of how well they could control the very bloodlines of the people they oppressed. Today, the survivors of the vanishing are a generation of elders who are only now discovering the true names of the women who birthed them. Many spent their entire lives in Belgium feeling a strange, phantom ache for a home they were told didn't want them, only to find that their mothers had never stopped searching. The records are finally being opened, but for many, the discovery comes too late to offer a reunion with the mothers who died in the dust. The vanishing proved that the Belgian Congo was not just a place of resource extraction, but a factory for the manufacturing of human loneliness. Marie-Therese' story is the story of thousands who were told they were nothing, only to realize they were the most precious things ever stolen. The secret is out, and the filing cabinets are finally yielding the truth to the children who refused to remain vanished.